On the morning of December 7, 1941, the world witnessed what would become one of the most devastating aerial assaults in military history. Above the burning ships of Pearl Harbor, a formation of fighter aircraft carved through the smoke-filled sky with lethal precision. These sleek, predatory machines bore the distinctive red circle of the rising sun on their wings, and their very presence would forever change the course of World War II. Yet hidden within the success of this dark day lay the seeds of their own destruction. For these aircraft, the legendary Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters would soon face a discovery that would strip away their mystique and expose their most vulnerable secrets. The Zero represented far more than mere machinery. It embodied the technological awakening of a nation that had spent centuries in isolation. When Japan emerged from its self-imposed seclusion in the mid-1800s, the phrase "made in Japan" had become synonymous with inferior quality and cheap imitation. Western powers viewed Japanese manufacturing as primitive, incapable of producing anything that could challenge European or American engineering superiority. This perception would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation that would cost thousands of Allied lives in the opening months of the Pacific conflict. The genesis of this revolutionary aircraft began in 1937, when the Imperial Japanese Navy issued specifications that seemed almost impossible to achieve. They demanded a fighter that could outmaneuver any opponent, possess extraordinary range for long-distance missions, and deliver devastating firepower, all while operating from the cramped confines of aircraft carrier decks. The task fell to 31-year-old Jiro Horikoshi, a brilliant aeronautical engineer working for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Horikoshi understood that conventional design approaches would never satisfy these demanding requirements, so he embarked on a path of innovation that would produce one of the most influential aircraft in aviation history. The A-6M's first flight occurred on April 1, 1939, and immediately demonstrated capabilities that exceeded even the Navy's ambitious specifications. The aircraft achieved a top speed of 350 miles per hour or 565 kilometers per hour at nearly 20,000 feet or 6,100 meters, powered by a Nakajima Sake 14-cylinder radial engine developing 940 horsepower. Its maximum range stretched an incredible 1,930 miles or 3,105 kilometers, allowing it to escort bomber formations deep into enemy territory and return safely to base. What truly set the Zero apart was its revolutionary construction philosophy. Horikoshi's team employed flush riveting throughout the airframe, creating an exceptionally smooth surface that reduced drag and increased speed. The wings featured an elegant elliptical design that provided outstanding lift characteristics, while perforated internal structures reduced weight without sacrificing structural integrity. The aircraft's empty weight of just 3,704 pounds, or 1,680 kilograms, made it extraordinarily agile, capable of outturning virtually any fighter in existence. The Zero's armament configuration was equally impressive, featuring two 20mm Type 99 cannons mounted in the wings, each loaded with 60 rounds, complemented by two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns in the engine cowling with 500 rounds per gun. This combination provided devastating firepower, capable of destroying enemy aircraft with short, precise bursts. Additional pylons could carry two 132-pound or 60-kilogram bombs for ground attack missions, making the Zero a versatile multi-role aircraft. The Zero's combat debut over China in mid-1940 revealed its true potential. Chinese Air Force pilots, flying obsolete biplanes, and early monoplane fighters found themselves completely outmatched. The Zero's speed, climb rate, and maneuverability allowed Japanese pilots to engage at will, attacking when advantageous and disengaging when threatened. The aircraft's superior range enabled it to appear over distant targets, where enemy forces least expected fighter escort, adding an element of surprise that proved consistently deadly. By December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed fewer than 300 Zeros, carefully distributed among frontline carrier units. These elite squadrons represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation, with pilots averaging over 600 hours of flying time and many flight leaders boasting more than 1,500 hours of experience. The Japanese pilot training program was deliberately brutal and selective, accepting no more than 100 candidates in some years and washing out large numbers through an intensive 7 to 9 month course that emphasized quality over quantity. When the Pacific War erupted with the attack on Pearl Harbor, 125 Zeros from 6 aircraft carriers participated in the assault. The sight of these unknown fighters diving through the morning sky over Oahu sent shockwaves through American military leadership. Intelligence reports had consistently underestimated Japanese technological capabilities, and the Zero's performance characteristics seemed almost impossible given Western assumptions about Japanese engineering competence. The early months of 1942 witnessed the Zero's complete domination of Pacific skies. Allied pilots flying Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, Seversky P-35s, and other contemporary fighters found themselves helplessly outmatched. The Zero achieved an extraordinary 12-to-1 kill ratio against Allied aircraft, a statistic that reflected not only superior aircraft performance, but also the exceptional skill of Japanese pilots. American and Allied aviators were forced to abandon traditional dogfighting tactics, instead adopting hit-and-run diving attacks that avoided prolonged aerial combat with the nimble Japanese fighters. However, the Zero's revolutionary design came with hidden compromises that would eventually prove fatal. Horikoshi's obsession with weight reduction had led to critical omissions in protective features. The aircraft lacked armor plating around the pilot and vital systems, making it extraordinarily vulnerable to enemy fire. More dangerously, the Zero's fuel tanks were not self-sealing, meaning that even minor battle damage could result in catastrophic fuel leaks and fires. The aircraft's lightweight construction, while providing exceptional maneuverability, also meant that its thin aluminum skin could be punctured by small-caliber ammunition that would barely scratch heavier Allied fighters. The Zero's control systems presented additional vulnerabilities that were not immediately apparent. The aircraft lacked hydraulic boosting for its ailerons and rudder, making it extremely difficult to maneuver at high speeds. During steep dives, the control surfaces became so stiff that pilots often found themselves unable to pull out of their attacks, sometimes leading to fatal ground impacts. The aircraft's tendency to roll more easily to the left than to the right created an asymmetric handling characteristic that experienced pilots could exploit. Perhaps most critically, the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine suffered from a fundamental design flaw in its carburetor system. The float-type carburetor would flood during negative G maneuvers, causing the engine to cut out at precisely the moments when pilots needed power most. This weakness meant that Zero pilots had to avoid certain aerobatic maneuvers that Allied pilots could perform without hesitation, creating tactical limitations that skilled opponents could exploit. The first hints of the Zero's vulnerabilities emerged during combat with the American Volunteer Group in China, where pilots like Claire Chennault began developing tactics specifically designed to counter Japanese advantages. The Flying Tigers discovered that the Zero could be defeated through careful use of altitude, speed, and diving attacks that avoided sustained turning combat. However, these lessons remained largely confined to the China theater, and most Allied pilots in the Pacific continued to fight the Zero using ineffective tactics well into 1942. The pivotal moment that would change everything occurred during the Aleutian Islands campaign, a secondary operation launched by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to divert American attention from the main assault on Midway. On June 4, 1942, a small Japanese force attacked Dutch Harbor in Alaska, beginning what would become a 14-month struggle for control of the Aleutian chain. Among the attacking aircraft were 3 Zeros from the aircraft carrier Juneau, led by experienced pilots tasked with neutralizing American air defenses on the remote Alaskan island. During the second day of attacks, 19-year-old Flight Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga found his Zero struck by ground fire while strafing installations at Dutch Harbor. The damage was not immediately fatal, but it was severe enough to force Koga to seek an emergency landing site. Flying with his 2 companions, he spotted what appeared to be a suitable grass field on nearby Akutan Island, roughly half a mile inland from Broad Bight. The flat green expanse looked solid and safe from altitude, and Koga made the fateful decision to attempt a wheels-down landing. What the young pilot could not see from his cockpit was that the seemingly solid ground was actually a treacherous bog covered by a thin layer of grass and moss. As Koga's Zero touched down, its landing gear immediately sank into the soft earth, causing the aircraft to nose over violently and flip onto its back. The impact killed Koga instantly, but remarkably, the aircraft itself suffered only minor damage. The soft, muddy ground that had claimed the pilot's life had also cushioned the Zero's crash, preserving it in nearly perfect condition. For over a month, the wrecked Zero lay undiscovered in its remote Aleutian resting place. The area was largely uninhabited, and American forces were focused on more pressing threats elsewhere in the Pacific. It was not until July 10, 1942, that Navy Lieutenant William Thies, piloting a Catalina PBY patrol aircraft, spotted the overturned fighter during a routine reconnaissance mission. The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. For the first time since the war began, American forces had captured an intact, modern Japanese fighter aircraft. The recovery operation began immediately, with Navy personnel carefully extracting the Zero from its muddy grave and preparing it for transport to the continental United States. The aircraft was shipped to the Naval Air Station San Diego, where a team of engineers and test pilots prepared to unlock the secrets of Japan's most formidable weapon. The captured Zero, now designated as Aircraft Number 4593, represented an intelligence coup of immense proportions. On September 20th, 1942, exactly 2 months after its capture, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders climbed into the cockpit of the restored Zero for its first flight under American colors. What followed were 24 intensive test flights conducted between September 20th and October 15th, during which American pilots systematically explored every aspect of the aircraft's performance envelope. These flights would prove to be among the most important intelligence-gathering missions of the entire Pacific War. Sanders and his fellow test pilots quickly identified the critical weaknesses that had remained hidden from Allied forces for nearly a year of combat. They confirmed that the Zero became increasingly difficult to control at high speeds, with aileron and rudder response becoming dangerously sluggish above 300 miles per hour or 480 kilometers per hour. During high-speed dives, the aircraft's control surfaces became so stiff that pilots required tremendous physical strength to avoid crashing into the ground. The asymmetric rolling characteristics discovered during testing revealed another exploitable weakness. The Zero rolled much more easily to the left than to the right, creating a predictable pattern that American pilots could use to their advantage. If a Zero pilot attempted to evade by rolling left, Allied pilots could anticipate the maneuver and position themselves accordingly. More importantly, the testing revealed that the Zero's legendary maneuverability was largely confined to low and medium speeds. At high velocities, it became as clumsy as any conventional fighter. Noted. Perhaps most significantly, the captured Zero confirmed the aircraft's complete lack of protective armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. American pilots had suspected these vulnerabilities, but the physical examination provided definitive proof. The aircraft's fuel system was particularly vulnerable, with tanks that would leak catastrophically if punctured by even small-caliber ammunition. The pilot sat completely unprotected, surrounded by fuel lines and electrical systems that could ignite if damaged. The intelligence gathered from the captured Zero was immediately disseminated throughout the Pacific Fleet, fundamentally altering Allied fighter tactics. Marine ace Kenneth Walsh, who would eventually be credited with destroying 21 Zeros, later stated that knowing what to do with a Zero on his tail, information that came from Koga's Zero, saved his life several times. The new tactical doctrine emphasized high-speed diving attacks that exploited the Zero's control difficulties while avoiding the prolonged turning fights where the Japanese fighter maintained its advantage. Grumman aircraft received detailed technical specifications from the captured Zero, information that proved invaluable in designing the F-6F Hellcat, which would become the primary American carrier fighter for the remainder of the war. The Hellcat incorporated lessons learned from studying the Zero, featuring heavy armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and an 18-cylinder engine that provided the power necessary to execute the new high-speed tactical doctrine. By early 1943, the effects of the captured Zero intelligence were becoming apparent in combat results throughout the Pacific. Allied pilots, who had previously avoided engagement with Japanese fighters, now actively sought combat, confident in their new tactical advantages. The Zero's kill ratio began to plummet as American pilots exploited its high-speed limitations and structural vulnerabilities. Simultaneously, Japan's ability to maintain the Zero's effectiveness was rapidly deteriorating due to pilot training limitations and industrial constraints. The intensive pre-war training program that had produced such skilled aviators proved impossible to sustain during wartime conditions. Fuel shortages meant that new pilots received drastically reduced flight hours, with some entering combat with fewer than 100 hours of total flying time compared to the 600 hours minimum of their predecessors. The quality of instruction also suffered as experienced pilots were kept in frontline combat roles rather than being rotated back to training duties. Japan's industrial capacity presented equally serious challenges to Zero production and development. While the United States was rapidly expanding its aircraft manufacturing capabilities, Japan's limited resources and industrial base could not match American production rates. Between 1940 and 1945, Japan produced approximately 10,815 Zeros, a respectable number, but far below the quantities needed to replace combat losses and equip new units. Attempts to improve the Zero's combat effectiveness through design modifications proved counterproductive. Later versions included self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection, but these additions increased the aircraft's weight by 28%, while engine power increased by only 16%. The result was a heavier, less maneuverable aircraft that retained the Zero designation, but had lost the very characteristics that had made it so formidable in early combat. By mid-1943, the introduction of new American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair had completely shifted the balance of air power in the Pacific. These aircraft featured 2,000 horsepower engines, heavy armor protection, and firepower that far exceeded the Zero's capabilities. More importantly, they were flown by pilots trained specifically to exploit the Zero's newly discovered weaknesses, turning the tables on Japan's once invincible fighter force. Now, the Zero's decline accelerated throughout 1944 as American industrial production reached unprecedented levels, while Japanese pilot quality continued to deteriorate. Major carrier battles like the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the complete reversal of fortunes that had occurred since Pearl Harbor. During this engagement, dubbed the Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, Japanese aircraft were destroyed at rates approaching 10-1 in favor of the United States. As Japan's strategic situation became increasingly desperate, the Zero found itself pressed into roles for which it was never designed. Beginning in October 1944, during the battle for the Philippines, Zeros were increasingly used in kamikaze attacks, their lightweight construction and long range making them suitable for one-way suicide missions. This represented the ultimate degradation of what had once been the world's premier fighter aircraft, reduced from a symbol of Japanese air superiority to an expendable weapon of desperation. The captured Zero continued to serve American interests until its destruction in a training accident in 1945, but its impact on the Pacific War had already been achieved. Admiral William Leonard, himself a fighter ace, summarized the intelligence value of the captured aircraft when he stated that no other captured machine has ever unlocked so many secrets at a time when the need was so great. The knowledge gained from studying Koga Zero had provided American forces with the tactical and technical insights necessary to defeat what had seemed an invincible enemy. The story of the Zero's rise and fall encompasses far more than the technical specifications of a single aircraft. It represents the collision of two industrial civilizations, each believing in the superiority of their technological and tactical approaches to warfare. Japan's emphasis on pilot skill, aircraft agility, and offensive capability had proven devastatingly effective in the war's opening phases, when highly trained aviators flew technically superior aircraft against surprised and unprepared opponents. However, the Zero's very strengths contained the seeds of its own defeat. The design compromises that made it so maneuverable and long-ranged also made it vulnerable to sustained combat against heavily armed and armored opponents. More critically, Japan's limited industrial capacity and inflexible training doctrine prevented the rapid adaptation necessary to maintain technological superiority in modern warfare. The captured Zero on Akutan Island represented the turning point where American industrial and technological capabilities began to assert themselves over Japanese innovation and pilot skill. The systematic analysis of the aircraft's strengths and weaknesses, followed by the rapid development of counter-tactics and superior equipment, demonstrated the importance of intelligence gathering and technological adaptation in modern warfare. By war's end, the Zero had been transformed from the terror of Allied pilots to a symbol of Japan's declining fortunes. Its graceful lines and revolutionary design remained impressive, but the aircraft had been surpassed by enemies who had learned from their early defeats and applied superior resources to develop overwhelming advantages. The single most important military aircraft ever shot down had revealed its secrets, and those secrets had changed the course of history in the Pacific War.